Hey, welcome to this podcast. On today's episode, we'll have a conversation about racism. If you want, you can skip the intro. Otherwise, let me just spend a few words introducing the topic and, of course, today's guest. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. This quote by American novelist James Baldwin couldn't be more true today. From the Me Too movement to Black Lives Matter, this seems to be a time of reckoning and confronting the ghosts of the past in the United States and many countries around the world. The horrible killing of George Floyd has sparked outrage across the board, being condemned by pretty much everyone. However, this incident reopened old wounds of a post-imperialistic, segregated world with protests all over the world and a new support for the Black Lives Matter movement and calling out police brutality, especially in the United States. But is it really enough if a company retweets Black Lives Matter on Twitter, or is it just a lazy way to ride the wave on a trending topic? What are the roots of all the problems, and what the possible real solutions? To get to the bottom of all this, I talked to Dr. Avery Smith, philosophy teacher at Loyola University Chicago and former communications officer at the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. While she lives in Chicago today, she also used to work and live in Rome, Italy, and therefore she brings a very unique set of experiences and expertise to this conversation. She is also currently working on a book on racism in America. Without further ado, here's my conversation with my friend Avery. I hope you enjoyed.
Avery.
Hey.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Thanks for your availability. It's very late in Chicago, I know, and I really appreciate your time being here. So we have about 20 minutes time now to solve racism.
Yay! We can do. You and I, we can do it.
We can do it. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Dream team.
There you go.
So before we start, first of all, how are you doing? How's the situation like in Chicago right now? Like, I mean, I'm sure there was also some kind of a lockdown or some variation of a lockdown in Chicago, like here in Italy.
Yes.
So what's going on there?
So we are opening up little by little, as the pandemic has hit. But luckily, or I don't know what the gods just shine down on Illinois, but we have a great Governor Pritzker, and a great mayor in Chicago, Lori Lightfoot, and they took the bull by the horns as much as they could from the very beginning. So we in Illinois are experiencing really I think a plateau of cases, while you have other states like Florida and Texas that are continuing to have an increase in cases. So little by little, the businesses are reopening, restaurants, parks. We have Lake Michigan, so we have the beaches along the lake. So those are also supposed to be opening. Now, for me and my family, we are really still staying put because the reality is we don't have a vaccine, we don't have a cure, and God forbid one of us catches it, it can be devastating. So in order to not put ourselves at risk and also other people, we are staying home.
Right. Well, it's a difficult, very challenging time, let's say. There's no lack of stuff happening at the moment.
Too much going on.
Yeah, and I want to get into that too, because maybe it's too much stuff happening at the same time to get to solutions. But don't want to get there yet. Okay. So are there let's start with the premise. We were talking about racism here today on this podcast.
Yes.
And I was born and raised in Germany. I live in Italy now, so I would like to draw a little comparison, even though, of course, you could not expect kind of comparing apples with oranges. But Germany, like the US, has had some dark chapters in the history, as you may or may not have heard, and which, mind you, was not that long ago. So
No.
my grandfather, he survived a bombing while he was playing in an open field as a child, if I remember his story correctly. So it's something that was witnessed within our family.
Sure.
And today, Germany, though, is everything but a racist country. If anything, there are strong anti-racist sentiments that run deep in the population and all institutions. I mean, of course, racism still exists also in Germany, and
Yeah.
there are also some extreme right-wing tendencies and anti-Semitism that's been observed, and it's quite worrying. But these are not, or don't appear to be, systemic, and the government is trying to fight these tendencies immediately and really hard.
Yeah.
So for Germany, the Constitution of '49, it guaranteed fundamental rights to everyone. And in the United States, there was the Civil Rights Act of '64, and that was a game changer. Not only if you think that it even paved the way to, it happened just the other day that the Supreme Court decided on the LGBT rights based on that Civil Rights Act. So long story short, but Germany seems to have pushed hard to acknowledge their part in these past times of history, and it seems like it's mostly succeeded and came to peace with its past. In the United States, on the other hand, the racial tensions never really seem to have dissolved. You always hear something in the news, and there seems to be a lot of political discussion every time you turn on the news. So what do you think about it? Why is that?
So well, first of all, what you see on the news is just the tip of the iceberg. That is just what everyone else is seeing, because what we're actually living is so much more insidious and so much deeper than anyone could imagine if they are not a person of color living in this country. And I do, I'm speaking as a Black woman, but I'm also including other people of color because it is that severe of a problem. So you make the comparison with Germany, which I think is quite appropriate because Germany's history with racism and genocide is so recent, just as the United States history with racism and genocide. So much so with the United States in particular that we are still involved in the genocide of not just the Black people. That is what's getting the most media attention. But I would like to draw attention also to our Native peoples, the Native Americans, because they are dying in higher numbers from COVID. All right. But that's only the most recent phenomenon that has hit the Native American community. Their women go missing. They just disappear. And there's nothing, there are no mechanisms to trigger the outrage in the broader American community. So our participation in this ongoing problem of racism and shall I just go ahead and say it, white supremacy, is it's because in this country, with all due respect and love for our white brothers and sisters, they refuse to, and when I say they, I'm talking about the royal they, right? Refuse to acknowledge the remnants of hatred that was born out of the chattel slavery era. An actual, this gut wrenching hatred that was born for Black people, for people who came to these lands, the Americas, because it's not just in the United States of America, but all of the Americas, that the African peoples that were brought to this land, and their descendants, that they were treated as objects to do the manual labor of building what we have today, right? And if we don't have a reckoning, if the white people in the United States of America in particular, because that's where I am, if they do not reckon with that reality, it's not the past. If they don't reckon with the reality, we will always have a George Floyd, a Trayvon Martin, a Tamir Rice, a Sandra Bland. Those Emmett Till, this 12-year-old kid back in the 50s that was beaten to such a degree that when he was beaten and then his body was put in a bog or in a body of water, and when his body was retrieved, it was bloated and unrecognizable, and his mother said, "We have to have an open casket for this funeral because I want the world to see what racism and white supremacy has done to my child." Emmett Till lives today in each one of us who is vulnerable to this white aggression. Yeah,
And
yeah.
and why do you think is it that it is so hard to have a conversation about this, especially in the United States?
Because no one wants to have that type of legacy, right? No one wants to say, well, my family, they owned slaves. My family made its fortune on the backs of Black people who did not have a choice, and that their descendants are still suffering, and I have not helped them. And nobody wants to take responsibility for that. That is, it's shameful. It's shameful to have to be a descendant of a slave holder, and it's supposedly shameful to have been a slave or a descendant of a slave, right? So there's this shame that is keeping us from speaking it out, right? And saying, you know what? We got it wrong. And we've been getting it wrong. But right now, and that's what this anti-racism movement is about that I'm seeing now. You have the hashtag Black Lives Matter. Now, that started some years ago, almost, I would say about 7, 8, almost maybe a decade ago.
Mm.
But it's gotten this resurgence. Why? Well, one, because of George Floyd and um, and some of the more recent killings of innocent Black people. But the other thing is COVID, right? Because we have been sequestered in our homes. And it's not just, people of color or Black people, it's everybody, right? Everybody's been sequestered in their homes. And if you're sequestered in your home, why is anything like that, the killing of an innocent person by an authority figure, a police officer, why is that happening, right? And then you add on top of that Black and brown people are experiencing more higher rates of mortality as a result of COVID. So COVID is really throwing everything that we have to contend with on a regular basis into full relief. So lack of education. And the education, it's not just in the books. It's not just going to school. Education goes to financial education, right? Medical education, education around nutrition and health, right? You have a lack of literacy when it comes to a lot of these. I don't want to call them topics, but a lot of these things that systemically contribute to Black and brown people not being able to surmount the huge obstacles that have been put in place by white supremacy and white privilege. All
Mm.
right. So I live in the South Side of Chicago. I have a PhD and several other degrees. My husband is finishing his PhD. He also has several other degrees, and yet, even having chosen to live in the South Side near University of Chicago, with all of the privilege that he and I have, and education is a privilege. With all the privilege that we have, we are still, um, you know, at risk of being hit by a stray bullet in 2021. How is that possible where you have so much education in one household, and yet, because of where we live, we are at risk? And we have dodged bullets before,
Mm.
literally. And that doesn't happen on the north side of town. We say, well, you guys are educated. Why don't you move to the north side of town? Why should we have to run from our own community, from our own people, black and brown people? Why should we have to run to the white side of town to not have to be in danger? Why should we have to go to the white side of town to not be in a food desert? Why should we have to go to the white side of town to make sure that our daughter can get a proper education? We should be able to live full lives in our own communities. And I'm not saying that black and brown people should just be segregated in their own communities. What I'm saying is that the communities that we build should be those that have everything we need.
Hmm. So what I read a little bit into your answer is that maybe the United States kind of missed their own Marshall Plan moment, like in Germany,
Oh
where
yeah.
there was some sort of coming together of different sides to the planning table, and where basically a clean cut was made, where there was some kind of process of reconciliate and accept your history and your responsibility and move forward. And the second element seems to be a very high risk of being shot. So maybe that has to do with the gun culture in the United States eventually. I don't know.
Absolutely.
Now, I'm not saying speaking for or against guns, because I understand it's a very complex topic, and in Canada they have guns, and there's not that amount of fatalities for some reason. So why is that?
Okay, so I'm gonna put the gun topic to the side just for the
Sure.
moment. I want to um highlight one thing that you alluded to, the fact that the United States has not taken responsibility. So after the Civil War, um, the states really became, because before the states, it was a federation, like a
Hmm.
confederation.
Right.
But after the Civil War, the laws were written in such a way that once a state or once a territory or a piece of land has been approved to be a state within the Union, that territory or piece of land that is now a state can no longer secede from the Union. Okay. So that creates that barrier from the North and South splitting up. Okay. Now, the other thing that happened, though, however, is that the South, even with the treaties and the new laws, they refused to accept certain things that should have been inherent to having lost the war, accepting that Black people were no longer slaves. So in officially speaking, Black people were no longer slaves, but especially in the South, the institutions that were erected did everything possible to pull Black people back into servitude. in servitude of, of the white brethren. All right. The other thing I want to say about that is, in any war, the loser does not get to raise their flag. And yet, after the Civil War, the Confederate States still used the Confederate battle flag. To this day, the state of Mississippi still has the Confederate battle flag as part of their state flag. Now, you say, what is that significance? Well, first of all, again, if you lose a war, then the victor gets to raise their flag, right? I mean, that just makes sense. So it's very symbolic that the Southern states continued to raise that Confederate battle flag. And what that has become is not just a resistance against the North. And some Southerners, some white Southerners, will say, that's just a reflection of our history and culture. Well, my family is from Texas, and I am a fifth generation Texan, so I've got family going back to the Civil War in Texas. That is not a part of my history that I want to celebrate. Okay, so we have to be careful of the rhetoric that's coming out of that. So with this whole idea of the Confederate flag, it's not a representation of Southern history and culture. It is a representation of the Southern white masters not wanting to let go of their Black chattel to this day. So that's one side. Okay, guns. Yeah. Guns in this country is one of the hallmarks of white privilege and supremacy. If you were watching any of the news back in early May, where you had people protesting the shelter-in-place orders, you had white men going up to state capitals armed with guns. Now, I guarantee you, I would not be able to get anywhere close to a municipal building, let alone a state capitol, with a gun on my back or in my hand. Mm. So what's the difference, right? And then a month later, with these riots, I don't want to say riots, no, with the protests, because the riots and the protests were two different things. With the protests for anti-racism, you had people of color, Black people in particular, marching peacefully, quietly, and maintaining social distance, right? And I hate the term social distance. I just say physical distance. Maintaining that distance, right? And yet they were still met with tear gas. Some people got shot by the authorities, unarmed. So how is it that a white man can go to a state capitol and threaten the sitting governor, and we cannot protest peacefully in the streets? So that's all I'll say about guns in the United States.
Right. It's a complex topic that we could probably do a couple hours separately to go into detail there. It's true. Now, do you fear that the maybe the right moment has already passed to, don't want to say that it's too late, but drawing again a parallel to Germany, just I don't want to abuse that kind of example there.
No,
but
I think it's appropriate.
One thing I noticed back then, because I went through the German education system as an Italian, and they kind of went deeply into analyzing and explaining the fault in the whole in the two wars, and also they made sure that we understand the responsibility, and it almost felt like they were transmitting a guilt in the education system. Like I was feeling guilty for Second World War, and I'm Italian, although even the Italians, as we know, they were not exactly innocent either. But you know what I'm trying to say.
Uh-huh.
And but then they had the reparations, and I think the last reparation payments finished a few years ago. I'm not sure if there's other payments coming, reparations towards Jewish communities and other communities, other countries that have been affected by Second World War. But then every now and then some situation comes up. I think Greece every now and then tries to get some money out of the Germans for reparations, and the Germans basically then have the stance: look, we already paid our reparations back then. This is done. Yeah. Now, this is something that is lacking for the United States, because there never has been such a moment where the reparations have been made. And I think the best moment would have been probably closer to the Civil Rights Act or even earlier. And now I understand that it can be hard to transmit this idea to the new generation, because in Germany now the young kids grow up, and they say, hey, what do I have to do with this all? It's not my fault.
Yeah.
So are you afraid that this moment where the generation that still was involved or still remembers actively is now getting older, and the new generation is going to forget about this or not feel so responsible for it, or just say I don't want to have anything to do with this? And is the moment for reparations or anything like this now already gone?
So I think the moment for reparations expired with Reconstruction. So that era directly after the Civil War, where the U.S. government tried to put institutions into place to help the former enslaved people make lives for themselves outside of servitude, right? That would have been a time for reparations. And in fact, there was, if you're familiar with Spike Lee, his production company is 40 Acres and a Mule, which is an homage to that was supposed to be the reparation. Every black, I think it was black male, I could be mistaken on that, but every black male was to get 40 acres and a mule. Now that didn't happen. And at this point in time, the United States of America could not afford to engage in reparations for slavery and Jim Crow. We couldn't afford it. Why? Because there's too many descendants of slavery now, right? We have multiplied. That's it. So that part is a wash. Now, what can happen? And it's funny. There was a Jesuit that asked me about the case for reparations from Georgetown University, and I'm not sure if you know, Georgetown University engaged in the slave trade. They owned slaves, and they sold some slaves down into, I want to say, Maryland and other southern states. So the Jesuits have this pretty marked stain in being involved with the slave trade. And so this Jesuit asked me, well, do you think that the Georgetown or the Jesuits owe, Black people reparations? I said, we don't want reparations. Now, when I say we, I'm sure there's some Black people say, no, I'll take a reparation. But what I'm saying is, more than reparation, we just want to be left alone to live our lives, to be able to educate our children, raise our children, go on vacation, have meaningful jobs that are consequential, something we can get satisfaction out of, right? We stop pulling us over for nonsense, stop incarcerating us, stop killing us, stop raping us, all of those things. Just leave us alone, right? That's what we want. That's what the whole Black Lives Matter movement is about. Is that our lives matter enough for you to, when you see us walking down the street, even if you think that we don't belong, just leave us alone. That's it. Right? So has that time passed? No. The opportunity for change is ever present as long as there is the problem. So as long as a person of color is targeted, then there's always the opportunity for improvement and change. Because what that's saying is that there's someone else, there's another person who is targeting that person of color. So that other person has the opportunity to grow and change and become better.
Now, here's a provocative thought before we move on to police and police brutality. In response to what you just said, is it possible that a part of our humanity does not allow us to completely solve racism? If you just look to Northern Ireland and the conflict that still exists and it's supposedly solved, go visit. Or if you look at the Gaza Strip and Israel, there's always the tendency of of human beings to make groups, categorize, and create a them versus us dynamic. From the small, less interesting things like sports to wars and racism and death and killings. So now that's why I said it's a provocative thought. Do you think that we really can ever solve that? Or is that something that's so deeply ingrained into the human condition to discriminate and be racist?
Well, I think what I'll say is I'll refer to my beloved Aristotle, where he talks about the categories, the fact that when we talk, we automatically categorize things. Why is that? Because we have to truncate our speech in order that we're not using so many words to describe this one thing that's like, 10 other things next to it, right? So you just group them together. So our tendency to do that is natural. And in a certain way, it would not make sense to not categorize. But the question then becomes, what do we do with that categorization? And is it benign? Or is there some malignancy in the way that we use it? And if we can refrain from weaponizing the categories against each other, or making one category advantageous against another, then we can start to heal. I mean, just look when we used to be able to travel, right? You go to take, was it EasyJet, right? EasyJet, low fare, everybody is pretty much doing their own thing, right? And you still have first class. How is that possible? If you've got a 26-euro flight from Rome to Paris, and you presumably all the tickets on that flight hover around 26 euros, then why is it necessary to still segregate a small population to get on the plane first, the plane that's still going, that everybody's going to the same place? So, this is something that we buy into on a whole number of levels. One, marketing, right? So, bigger is better and more is better and all this stuff, right? So I got a chance to get on the plane first, so that must mean something about me. And you're all the way at the back of the line, that means something about you. And we have to get over that. And then I'll refer to one other philosopher, Jesus of Nazareth. He said, the first shall be last and the last shall be first. And what he was saying with that is, stop trying to designate, this is good, that's bad. Because what you think you designated, you may have misinterpreted, and it's completely opposite.
Actually, I want to get into that a little bit later when I want to talk a bit about mental maps and the ways that people actually attribute different things to the same word. Not necessarily with malicious thoughts, but just because they interpret it differently. But okay, I want to talk a bit about the police now in the United States. After the horrible killing of George Floyd, it's a topic that has re-emerged because it's not the first time this emerges, of course, in the United States especially. That's police brutality. There's a lot of protests going on, and is it because the police in the States, is it perceived or is it considered to be the most racist institution in the United States? Or was it just the brutality in itself, and was it just the so-called straw that broke the camel's back and reopened old wounds with the police and the way they handle their encounters with citizens?
That's a great question.
Or mishandle in that case, because they didn't really handle it. They
that's a great question. Now, I would hesitate to designate any institution as most racist. And the reason is because each institution, the racism that we experience from each side, each facet of our lives is so consequential, right? So while I personally have never had a run-in with racist police, I still have had significant racism thrown at me in the education system. Right, that has impacted me in a certain way, right? So I wouldn't say that the police that they're the most racist. That I think that they are perhaps the most visible, especially now in the age of social media where you can live stream anything. And also because of the way their authority has been interpreted as absolute in micro situations. So when someone abuses that type of power, it can feel so overwhelming that we can in a certain sense, kind of push the other racist things that we experience to the side. It's like getting slapped in the face when your body is burning, right? So it's like your body's burning, but that slap in the face, like, ooh, that really,
Okay, maybe it's also the trust that you potentially put into those figures as an authoritative figure. In Germany, it's called the police, your friend and helper. So there's this whole image, about how this is like almost like a father figure. I wouldn't say father figure, that sounds a bit exaggerated, but somebody anyway, a good friend that you trust. And maybe if that
like
good
a big
friend,
brother.
Yeah, like exactly. And if your big brother all of a sudden shoots you, you feel really betrayed. Exactly. So, but how is it then that you talked about power of the police? I mean, let's put aside all these TV shows, cops, and all these images that they created on the media. How is it though that I remember as a child I was always dreaming about the States. I wanted to move there one day, and I was reading a lot. And one of the things that came up every now and then, strange enough, I remember it now, is they talked about police officers, and if they pull you over, keep your hands on the steering wheel because they might shoot you. They even mentioned that in tour guides for Europeans coming to the United States. So how is it that this aggressive image, is there any cause or reason for this aggressive image that has built up around the police? Is it just a tougher environment, or is it just by design that they want to make themselves respected and they think brutality is one way to do that?
Well, I think that there's a lot going on there. So I think, first of all, the police in America have so much to contend with on a day-to-day basis because of the gun culture, one, right? So if you have a citizenry that is able to carry a lethal weapon, you don't know who's carrying, and you don't know who is trained. You don't know what their motivations are. And whenever a police officer stops a person, they are automatically putting themselves in harm's way. I mean, theoretically speaking, right?
Right.
So on that level, you kind of understand a reticence to let your guard down from their side. I
Right.
get that. But at the same time, so our police officers is to protect and serve. Protect and serve whom? And there's this dog whistle phrase that's used in our country so much, law and order, law and
Mm.
order, law and order, right? That is really, keep the thugs, black people, in their place, right? So you have a skittish cop to begin with, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who's not sure if you're carrying a weapon. And then you have this mentality of black people, brown people need to be kept in their place. They need to be docile. They shouldn't, everything that you imagine a subservient person to be, that is what they are. That's the image that has been portrayed that we should be when we encounter the cops. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And that automatically, if you have that privilege, that authority, absolute power corrupts absolutely,
Right.
right? And I'm not saying that all cops are corrupt. I'm saying that when you really let that mentality take hold in any situation, you've been a doctor. We have doctors that are complete assholes because they have that mentality. You have
Mm.
teachers that are complete assholes because they have that mentality. But when you have a person who is charged with keeping order in the community, of protecting and serving, and they also have lethal power to make sure that their word is law, that's dangerous.
Right. So what's the possible solution? Because some call for defunding the police, and I'm not sure if they mean to abolish it completely and put something else in their place, or to fund them actually even more, but maybe connect it to very strict constraints. For example, I hear that the training is really bad for many cops, or very, very short and bad. So a very good combination. So maybe a solution could be to fund them more, but only if they have a good training, or fund them just for the training and extend the training. I have an idea. It's not only my idea. And what do you think about that? What about teaching cops to do martial arts, and in particular Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu? Not only because I'm a fan, but also because it allows you to effectively neutralize your opponent without punching, without hurting them, and it's one of the most efficient ways to control the other person. Now, one thing that some people might be worried about is part of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is choking. However, to become a martial artist, a competent one, it takes years of training. So if you would apply a choke, you would actually know what choke makes you pass out and neutralizes the other person, and which one would kill the other person. In fact, I do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu with other friends of mine, and we choke each other continuously, but we never kill each other. So it has to do with the fact that we know what we're doing. Yeah. And another side effect is that it would give confidence to the police officers that they actually know they can handle a situation because they are aware of the skills that they have in a certain situation. Because de-escalation is one of the things that you actually learn. Many people think that martial arts is like all these macho guys and trying to show this. Many people start and join gyms for that reason, but they will disappear very easily because it takes discipline and a different mentality to actually reach higher degrees within the martial arts. And so less situations would arise where actually the cop takes a gun because he or she feels like they are nervous and anxious and don't know whether they could handle a situation. What do you think about that?
I think I think that let's say the people who have died in chokeholds. So Eric Garner, for instance, he was in a chokehold.
Right.
Um, we're assuming that that cop didn't know what they were doing. That might not be a good assumption. That
Mhm.
cop may have known exactly what he was doing.
Right.
Or this what's the cop's last name, Siobhan or whatever, that killed George Floyd.
Mm.
He was on that man's neck for 8 minutes and what, 46 seconds. He knew what he was doing.
Right.
So I think there's merit to your idea of training cops in the martial arts, because it does require discipline, self-control, um, breathing. Right? We underestimate how much benefit that we get from breathing in through our nose, and how calming it can be, oxygenating our brain and our bodies, right? And
Right.
balancing the CO2 with the O2. But the problem is, if you put that in the same context that we are living today, all you have are even more powerful cops who are biased against Black and brown people. So
Mm.
I think what they said, what is the solution? What should defund? I don't even know what that means. Like you said, like, well, it can mean several things.
Right.
But if the cops are trained to see Black and brown people as threats, then nothing will change. Black and brown cops are trained to see Black and brown people as threats. That's a problem.
Mm.
We need to completely overhaul the police system. What that looks like, I don't know. But
Mm.
what we're doing today isn't working. And tearing off a piece and saying, oh, we got the cancer, and oh, the body is fine.
Right.
That's not working, because it has metastasized.
Mm.
It's in the entire body. So we have to do a complete overhaul of the policing system. And perhaps what we need to do is bring in police from other countries who do not have the socialized biases
Mm.
against people of color. I don't know.
Right. Well, I agree. And before moving on to the next topic, which is technology and media, I think a part of the solution, because there can never be just one solution, obviously. I think, but a big chunk is going to be in the training program, because there you instill culture, there you make psychological assessments, and if you make it long enough, because in other countries, I think you have to train for years before you become actually an officer in the field. By then, I think you can make a pretty good assessment of who are those that tend to abuse their power and who are not.
Yeah.
I don't think you will ever be able to, filter out 100% of all the bad
Oh,
grass, and that's impossible because we also change. Like,
yes,
people change also from good to bad and from bad to good. So, but
exactly.
yeah. So
Yeah.
yeah, and in fact now it is a good transition to the next topic, unless you have to leave, because I think we already exceeded the scheduled time by
No, you're fine. You're fine.
twice the amount, but I think we have most major topics covered. Yeah, technology and media. We see more of the incidents that we did in the past, also thanks to, or mainly thanks to technology, actually, because most smartphones they all have cameras now. And so everyone can be a reporter about anything at any time. Do you think technology can also play a role in helping solving the problem of racism? I mean, in a way, it already helps by showing more of it. Things that we wished not to see, now we see them. But do you think there are other ways that technology actually can help us to overcome racism?
Well, I think that we have to look at technology like, like using our smartphones to record incidences and to pass on these messages. I think we have to look at them like a petri dish in a lab, or a slide that you put under the microscope. Once you can see the problem, right? You've got a petri dish and you've got colonies of bacteria. You see the problem, but once you've seen the problem, that does not mean that there's going to be any action. So it has to be coupled with action. So great, we have this video of George Floyd's murder. Now what? And people said, "I'm marching." That is how media is going to work. Is that if we act on what it is that we are recording and witnessing and testifying to.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of social media, do you think that actually, because part of it is using social media then to gather and to create use it for activism and organize real meetings and real protests.
Yeah.
But then there's also the part of social media that I'm personally not a big fan of, and because I just think it's inefficient and it's just mostly virtue signaling, which is reposting stuff, reposting one sentence chance, and it's also a cheap way, I think, to show, hey, I support this cause, and then on to the next, and then on to the next YouTube video, or companies also, everybody's now using the hashtag Black Lives Matter and this and that, and we support this and that. It's a Instagram post here and a video there, and then we move on with business as usual. So isn't it also there a risk to kind of undermine a movement, or just to create a lot of noise and then nothing comes out of it? I'm just talking about social media now.
Sure. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And that, I think you do have both things happening where people are using social media as a means of creating communities that are then spurred to action, right? That they are organizing through social media. I think that's great. But you've got all these hashtags going, slogans, got celebrities, Black Lives Matter, when it's like it's so contrived,
Right.
and it's quite sickening. It's like I remember when the Supreme Court approved gay marriage in the United States, and everybody was putting rainbows on their Facebook, and while I supported it, I couldn't do that because I felt like it was cheapening the entire effort, the entire success, right? I'm not LGBTQ. So for me to come out at the 11th hour and say, yay, so ostentatiously, it completely cheapens the entire thing. And I think that's what's happening.
I agree.
When, like, I'll say companies like Nike, where Nike stood with Colin Kaepernick. They stood with Colin Kaepernick when it was not fashionable. That's a company I can roll with. The I think what Starbucks now they're saying, oh, okay, yeah, Black Lives Matter. Too late. I'm sorry, you should have been supporting Colin Kaepernick 3 years ago. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Weren't they the one arresting a black kid before hanging out there?
Yeah.
Okay, that's a whole different story. So I'm sure you're aware of Darrell Davis because he's from Chicago. Or if you're not aware, or our listeners or viewers are not aware of it, he's a blues musician, and he famously befriended many Ku Klux Klan members. He went to many of their rallies. He was accepted even by many of those in those groups, which is extraordinary because for everybody who doesn't know him, Darrell is black, and he befriended these people, and he managed to get over 200 Klan members to abandon the KKK. So do you think that personal relationships ultimately will trump policies, or are the best?
Why do you use that word?
Sorry, the word is tainted now. I tried not to use it.
Yeah,
Um,
no, that's a good question. I do.
yeah,
I do. I mean, it's hard to be mean to someone when you have to look them in the eye.
mm,
It's hard um to dehumanize someone when you are breaking bread with them.
right,
When you're sitting at the same table, and you're laying out your cards, right? This is who I am. In all of my frailty, in all of my inequity, right? In everything that makes me human, the good, the bad, and the ugly.
hmm
And you see that while the cards may be of a different combination, they're all the same. Because we're all the same, right? If you sit me down with a white supremacist, an avowed neo-Nazi, Ku Klux Klan member, whatever, if you sit me down with a 40-year-old white supremacist who has a child and a spouse, and we start swapping stories, it's going to be the same thing. We are worried about our children. We're, trying to get through day to day, right? Paying
hmm
bills, negotiating marriages, dealing with parents that are getting older, dealing with siblings, jobs. All of that is universal.
right,
So when you put these people together, when you have people that are willing to be vulnerable and put their lives on the line and make those steps, yeah, it is changing. It
right.
it it, it has to.
I mean, that's my beef that I have with social media because it takes away all this what you just said. And also you miss all the nonverbal communication cues that you would have otherwise, looking the other person in the eye. Also, and it's a whole different topic, and I'm not getting into it now, and I'm just going to wrap up with one last question after this, because otherwise we are really going to turn this into a 5-hour conversation. um, but yeah, we have different also experiences and different mental models. So when we just write a few words online, you don't know how the other person meant it. You don't know what is connected to those words. For some people, a word is very loaded. For the other person, maybe it means the complete contrary. You don't know that. Sometimes you don't even know your partner that you've been together with for years, really. And sometimes you realize you don't even knew them. You never really knew them or whatever, or with friends. So it takes time to really get to know a person, let alone get to understand their intentions when you write. But you mentioned before sitting together with somebody, some white supremacist who was 40 years old. It reminds me of Italy. There used to be this small pub where actually these situations would happen, that you would have a communist and a white supremacist and a prostitute and working class people and students, and everybody together was just drinking and having a good time most of the time.
Most of the time.
Most of the time, yeah. So then I want to come, and this is the transition, then the segue to your experience, because you lived in Italy for a long time.
Yeah.
And I read recently, it's a study from a few years ago, but it's a study that says that Italy is amongst the most racist countries in Europe, in the way they treat Sinti and Roma families and immigrants and all these things. So what's your personal experience from your time in Italy? Was it hard?
Well, I have to say that I had a very good experience in Italy, and that's mostly because I am from the United States of America. So what I witnessed is racism against, like you said, immigrants mainly from Eastern Europe and Africa, and some of Asian countries, but mostly Eastern Europe and Africa. And when Italians would meet me, they would ask, "Oh, where are you from?" And so I would tell them, oh, I'm from Texas, and like, oh wow. And then their attitude would completely change. Now, I did have several occasions where they would press me for an answer. Well, no, no, no. What part of Africa are you from? I'm like, I'm not from Africa. The Texas part of Africa? I don't know. So in
Yeah.
that way, their ignorance of what a Black person from the United States is
Mm.
showed, but I didn't feel a an overt prejudice or hatred against me for being a Black American. Once
Mm.
they found out I was American, they kind of lumped me in with every other American that they'd ever, known or heard of.
Right.
We're all the same, right? We're fat,
Mm.
we are rich, and we're spoiled. That was the stereotype. But then I did, witness the racism against the Roma in particular.
Mhm.
And that was painful. But as someone coming from the United States of America, I had a steep learning curve because in the United States we don't have the Roma population like we had in Italy. So it was always a caricature. And so for me to encounter a Roma, it was it was just a completely new experience for me, and I didn't know what to do with it. So as I was observing the Italians interacting with the Roma, it was something for me to kind of unravel, because on one sense the Italians have this disdain against the Roma. But then on the other hand, there's this like infantile affection that they have for them. It's like, oh, we have to take care of our Roma. We have to give them the money, whatever. Um, and so that dichotomy was something that never really sat well with me, where I could really uh, like intellectualize it and understand it.
Mm.
Um, and then, of course, like I said, with the Eastern Europeans and the Africans, the disdain was pretty obvious. I remember one time I was taking the bus. It was the 47 from Anyanina into to where I used to live,
Mhm.
in Tor Vergata, and this older woman who looked like she was from either Eritrea or Ethiopia was getting on the bus, and she was taking a while because she was elderly, and she had the cross tattooed in her forehead. She had her veil. So, I mean, her ethnicity was very apparent.
Mhm.
And at a certain point, the bus driver, who was Italian, I presume he was Italian, um, I think he got frustrated with her. And so he um, advanced the bus and stopped really quickly to make her fall on the bus.
Really?
And yeah, yeah. And
Wow.
I was appalled, because I could not see him doing that to an Italian nonna.
Yeah, I should have tried also because my Italian nonna, she would have beaten the crap out of him.
I know, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you're right about the observation. There are many things that do not make much sense here in this country as well. And there's
Yeah.
also a lot of discrimination between the North and the South.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you just think about how people talk about Neapolitans, and the more you go up from Brescia up,
Yeah.
it's complex and it's very often contradictory. So
Yeah. Well, and I don't know if you know, I'm married to a Roman, right? My
yeah.
husband is from Trastevere e Testaccio, so
Ed,
Romano
Ed,
Romano.
Ed Dai, as they say in Rome, Ed Dai.
And one of the things that I don't think he'll mind me saying this is he is very proud of being Mediterranean,
Mm.
very proud of um, being a person of color in the United States, right? He does not want to be identified as white. He said because he's not, right? He's not Germanic. He's not Anglo-Saxon. He is a mix of Phoenician, a mix with all the different ethnicities that populated the southern part of the Italian peninsula, and he's proud of it. He'll be the first to say, yeah, I've got African blood. I've got Jewish blood. I've got this. And that is missing, right? I feel like there's so many Italians in Italy who have just disconnected with that bloodline, with that culture. I think that the other problem of this white supremacy and privilege is coming out of colonization. So you have Coca-Cola everywhere, McDonald's everywhere, KFC everywhere. Why is that? Why do we have to have Coca-Cola, out in Tor Vergata, right? Or McDonald's out in the countryside? Why can we not just have the trattoria, the local trattoria that everybody goes to? Is that we're losing, and I say we because I very much feel Italian because I spent so much time there. I have a daughter who's Italian now, and so I feel like we are losing that just prehistoric and historic culture in Italy, and we're trading it in for something that is so not us, so not. It's not even something we can really bank on. That McDonald's is going to disappear, but spaghetti.
All right. Wow, I think we covered quite a lot. We have not solved racism yet, I think, but we keep the conversation open.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for for this conversation. I don't know if you know, I don't think I told you, I'm actually writing a book on anti-racism, more specifically. I don't know if you're familiar with W.E.B. Du Bois. He is an American sociologist, Black sociologist, post-Reconstruction, early 20th century. And he wrote a series of essays called The Souls of Black Folk. And in one of his essays, he asks the question, how does it feel to be a problem? So I'm writing a book that's exploring the experience of being relegated, dehumanized to a problem, and what that means and what that looks like. Wow. So I'm first posing that question to Black people, brown people, and then I'll be opening it up to other marginalized groups, LGBTQ, disabled communities, etc. So this was this was enjoyable on so many levels, on an intellectual level, but also just between friends. We haven't seen each other in ages, and I'm sorry.
It's been too long.
It's been too long. Next time I'm in Rome, we're gonna have a pint.
Absolutely.
But it's so to be able to speak openly and honestly about some of the experiences that I have had personally. And then the experiences that the communities of color in the United States have had is really cathartic. And I hope that more people are able to engage in these conversations and just let it all out.
It's important to keep the conversation going. And well, of course, once you finish the book, you're more than welcome to come back on the show and we'll talk about it.
I look forward to it. All right.
All right. Thank you very much, Avery. Thank you so much.
All right. Take care.